You're listening to the Behind the Scenes Podcast Diary, episode number 14. Welcome to Amelia's Behind the Scenes Podcast Diary, an exclusive look at the behind the scenes misadventures of a 30-something thriller writer. Discover how close she is to releasing her latest novel, hear exciting details about upcoming writing projects, and discover the lessons she has learned along her writing journey so you don't have to make the same mistakes. You can find the episode show notes and lots more information at ameliahay.com/podcast/BTS. Hello writers, now that I'm well into revising the first draft of Missing, I've decided to share with you the top 5 first draft mistakes I made as I wrote my first 3 thriller novels, Missing, Silence and Immunity, because apparently I love to embarrass myself in front of an audience and openly point out my flaws. But I'm not going to stop there. In the second part of this behind the scenes podcast diary episode, I will share with you 5 tips highlighting how to avoid making these mistakes in your own writing. Before we dive into the super fun trip down memory lane, make sure you stick around to the third part of this episode where I will share a quick revision update, the comment of the week, and update you on what's coming up next in season 1 of this podcast. For some reason, when I first thought of the idea for this podcast diary, I assumed this was going to be a painful episode to write, but boy was I wrong. What was difficult was avoiding cliche writing mistakes. You know, those videos or blog posts that highlight mistakes first-time writers make. I think what made this easier was my decision to pull the mistakes solely from the first drafts of my thriller novels. It turned out that the hard part was narrowing down the list of mistakes. I apparently have no trouble highlighting my writing pitfalls. So here are my top 5 first draft mistakes. Mistake number 1, editing and writing the first draft at the same time. In the name of experimentation, I decided to share a revised version of the first draft of Missing on my blog. This experience turned on that critical editing voice in my head. I'm a perfectionist, so trust me when I throw around the word critical. If you only get one thing from this episode, then take this on wholeheartedly. Do not edit as you write your first draft, especially if you're relatively new to writing. I've just finished my 3rd book and I will never do this again, even if I wanted to blog a revised draft of a novel. This one mistake led to other writing mistakes, which has put me behind in my production schedule. Making mistakes is one of those things. It's a chicken or the egg scenario. It's almost impossible to learn without them. And you will too. You'll make your own mistakes, but hopefully you will not make these mistakes. Mistake number 2, obsessing over realism in fiction. I know I've mentioned this mistake in a podcast diary episode before, so I'll be brief. As I reached the end of the second act of Missing during the first draft writing phase, I flipped out. This flipping out had everything to do with mistake number 1. Because I was reading the previous scenes and performing line edits, so the draft was fit for reading, I was aware of the flaws in my manuscript. As a result, I took to Facebook and posed a question to a writing group. After that, I ended up asking a fellow thriller writer and former BBC journalist a question on realism and thrillers. In short, I spent too much time stressing and obsessing over the realism in an incomplete first draft instead of finishing the story. The one good thing that came from this, apart from the insights from other writers, is the realization that realism is another one of those story elements that needed to be left for the revision phase of writing. Mistake number 3, put off writing scenes because I wanted to do more setting or location research. Again, this is something that needed to wait until the revision phase. The first draft is all about getting the story out of my head and onto the page, then perfecting it later. This mistake is also closely related to realism because I was obsessing over real places and a setting that was inspired by a real-life museum. I think I mentioned this in a video that's on my YouTube channel. In this video, I mentioned how I spent valuable writing time researching what happened after the police are finished with a crime scene, including appearance and whether the characters could return to the scene so quickly. While the information I gathered was interesting and helped me write the scene, I could have added this later and focused on finishing the draft. You're sensing a theme here, aren't you? Mistake number 4, rushing through the story planning phase. When I started to create the idea that later became Immunity, I took my time. I started with the villain first and then the protagonist. After that, the story flowed from there. The next step to go from a long synopsis to a fully fleshed out outline was smooth and almost seemed natural. However, when I decided to write Silence, things went a little differently. After finishing the first draft of Immunity at the end of October, I decided in the final hour on October 31st, 2016, that I was going to participate in National Novel Writing Month. This led me to rush through the story creation, outlining, and character creation and research phases. I ended up choosing a limited amount of fictional locations, which needed to be changed in the revision phase to real-life locations around Oxford. Nevertheless, I will confess that taking a research trip to Oxford, where I scouted locations for Silence, was a lot of fun. This story creation sprint, which lasted a mere 4 days, caused me to overlook a crucial element in my story, and that story element was character motivations. It wasn't all character motivations, but one seemingly insignificant character that turned out to be the backbone of my entire story. I failed to flesh out the motivation of a character who was the victim of a crime and didn't make it past the prologue. However, because I'm writing a thriller and the protagonist needs to solve the mystery behind the murder, then stop the villain from making his next move, this character motivation became integral to the story. Even as you read the current first draft, you can still tell that I've overlooked this. Mistake number 5, not understanding point of view before writing. My writing journey started in 2011 with my pursuit of screenwriting. As a result, I understood story structure, outlining, and creating characters when I started writing my first thriller novel. What I was unfamiliar with was writing narrative exposition, and more specifically, I failed at writing from the point of view of a character. Well, I didn't fail, I just chose a point of view that added distance between the reader and my characters. To be honest, I didn't know what I was doing and therefore didn't know enough to make a great point of view decision. Eventually, as I started writing the first draft of Immunity, I realized my mistake and eventually changed the point of view from omniscient to third limited and then changed it again to deep third person. I guess in order to learn this lesson, I needed to make the mistake of choosing the wrong point of view. And that's how I learned, by doing. Now that I've said that, I wouldn't make this mistake again. If I had the chance to write Immunity from scratch, I would choose a multiple deep third person point of view from the start, because there's nothing more tedious than having to go back and change the point of view in a 120,000 word novel. One of the upsides of looking back at your writing mistakes after you've finished writing the first draft of your third novel is hindsight. It truly is a beautiful thing. As I look back over those 5 mistakes, the solutions become quite apparent to me. So here are the top 5 tips to avoid the mistakes I just shared with you. Tip number 1, start with the crime and the whodunit before you outline. This tip has a lot to do with the genre of my series. When you write in the crime, mystery, and thriller categories, you need to start with the crime. Describe how it occurs in real time, then figure out the whodunit, why, and inject realism in the story idea before you outline and write the first draft. This way, you know exactly what happens and why, and can leave red herrings along the way. You can add red herrings to your story outline, but you can also add these during revisions. Yes, I'm a control freak, and I do realize that not everyone likes to write this way, but I do. Tip number 2, do one more round of editing your outline before you start the first draft. I got this tip through experience, and my decision was later confirmed to me through a masterclass on writing with James Patterson. As I created the outline for Missing, I went back over and checked that every scene was in the right place and served the story. While I have cut scenes from the first draft of Missing, it was because I wanted James to take a different path to arrive at the same story ending, not because the story didn't make sense or Act 2 was a little muddy. I decided that James was working too closely with the police and wanted him to have his own investigation separate from the police procedure. Even though I got this right with Missing, this was something I skipped as I wrote Silence and Immunity. As a result, I've spent more time revising books 2 and 3. So it really does pay to go through your outline one last time before you write the first draft. Tip number 3, create setting or location profiles during the outlining phase. The outlining phase is a great moment to do research. To find house plans, search for Google Images, and take trips to locations and see and experience them for yourself. I now realize that I need to take things one step further and create location profiles with pictures and details to help me write better setting descriptions, which is something I suck at. Unfortunately, I made the mistake of not doing enough research into setting in each of my 3 novels for various reasons, but it all comes down to being in a hurry to get started and write. While motivation is a beautiful thing, I needed to slow down and set myself up for success before I opened Scrivener and put my fingers on the keyboard. Tip number 4, embrace fast drafting. We've all heard that catchphrase, you can't edit a blank page. It really is that simple. One of the biggest pitfalls for me is writing the first draft. My favorite parts of writing a novel are the idea and planning phase and revisions. Writing the first draft is where I struggle because I've done all of the story discovery beforehand. After that, all I have left is to get the story out of my head and onto the page. That's where fast drafting comes into play. So for my 4th thriller onwards, I need to write the first draft as quickly as possible. By embracing fast drafting, I will leave a short note in parentheses if I get stuck instead of diving down the rabbit hole of research, or just move on to another scene further on in the story and then come back to where I got stuck at a later time. That's the bonus of outlining. I know what's going to happen and I can jump about and not write the scenes in order. I did do this with my first 3 novels, but I still allowed myself to get stuck and obsess over elements in my story. In my 4th novel, I'm going to be more strict with this rule. Tip number 5, understand how to write a novel before starting the first draft. You don't need to know everything, just enough to get started. Because I started out writing screenplays, I wish I researched how to set the scene and writing dialogue. While you do set the scene in a screenplay and write dialogue, it's done differently. As you write dialogue in a novel, you also show how the character is acting. Whereas in a screenplay, you rely on the actor, director, and camera to do those things. It's the same thing with scene setting in a screenplay. It's minimal and it's the job of the director and camera to convey these things. Essentially, a screenplay is the skeleton of a story, whereas a novel is the equivalent of a one-man band indie filmmaker who plays every role from the actor to the director through to the film editor. My first ever novel, which was a romantic comedy set on Broadway, read too much like a screenplay. Just a side note, as I was writing this, the TV show Smash was released in the UK. I remember being super annoyed at this revelation. What would have helped with that romantic comedy was understanding a little bit about how to set the scene and writing dialogue for a novel. I didn't need to know everything, just those 2 elements would have gone a long way. My advice to you is to figure out your biggest struggle and understand how to fix that. For some people, it might be story structure or creating believable characters. So focus on whatever you need to know to get started. You don't have to follow a strict outline. You can flesh out the key scenes and discover the rest of the story as you write. Do what works for you. All I can show you is how I write. I made quite a few mistakes writing my first 3 thriller novels, and as a result, I've learnt a few lessons along the way. Lessons that I can put into practice for next time. These lessons are: start with the crime and the whodunit before you outline. Do one more round of editing your outline before you start the first draft. Create setting or location profiles in the outlining phase. Embrace fast drafting. Understand how to write a novel before starting the first draft. Are you writing the first draft of a novel? Or perhaps you've recently finished the first draft of a story. What's the one thing you would do differently next time? Let me know by coming over to the show notes on the blog at ameliahay.com/BTS014 and leave your answer in the comments section. Or alternatively, you can tweet me your answer at writer ADHay, and that's HAY. Coming up next, I have a special announcement for an upcoming episode and a new super fun segment of the show, so make sure you stick around. And if you don't, have a great day and thanks for listening. In a previous episode, I mentioned that I wanted to devote a show of the Behind the Scenes podcast diary, it's answering a few frequently asked questions on writing and story structure. Since that last episode of the podcast, I travelled to Paris and spent 4 days, including the weekend, with Roland. On the way back, I caught the viral plague and sounded like something out of a zombie apocalypse movie. I had every intention of attempting to record through my cold, but my breathing was heavy and I soon realised that no amount of editing or remastering would ever fix the sound. Because these podcast episode recordings are forever, I ended up not recording for a few weeks. As a result, I've had to push back the podcast recording schedule, which means the bonus Ask Me Anything I'm Writing show will now be released on Saturday the 9th of March at 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. If you have a question that you would love me to answer in this bonus episode, then submit your question via the form on my website at ameliahay.com/question. This week on Twitter, Gary sent me a picture of his notebook where he was organising his day while listening to the previous episode of the podcast on how to write the denouement scenes for your novel. To me, his notebook reminds me of a Moleskine journal, the one with the grid of dots instead of just the straight lines. They have quite unusual names that I can never, well, they don't have unusual names. I think they have German names, and I can't actually remember the name of this Moleskine, but it looks quite cute. He said, listening to your podcast on Stitcher and writing up my schedule for the day, and enjoyed your denouement tips. Thanks, Gary, for sending me that photo. I'm glad you're finding the writing tips helpful. I've decided that I want to start building a community around the podcast through Twitter because at the moment it feels like I'm talking into a void. So I'm a little curious, where are you listening to the Authorpreneur podcast? Feel free to snap a quick photo and tweet me at writer@adhay and I'll share it on the next week's episode. Thank you for listening and happy reading and writing, everybody. Thank you for listening to Amelia's Behind the Scenes podcast diary. If you love this episode, then hit the subscribe button and leave a review on your favourite podcasting app. I'm your host, Amelia, and I'll see you next week for another diary episode.